In February of 1296, the most accomplished castle builder in Europe sat down and wrote a letter to the English treasury, trying to explain where the money had gone. 400 masons, 2,000 laborers, 100 carts, 60 wagons, 30 boats hauling stone and sea coal across the Menai Strait. And he had to admit that none of that included the garrison, or the materials. He ended it by saying his men had not been paid, and that he could not keep them, because they had nothing to live on. The man writing was Master James of St. George, and the building he was trying to justify stands today on the eastern shore of Anglesey, low and grey and perfectly symmetrical, surrounded by a water-filled moat and a wide flat green field. Beaumaris Castle. It is one of the most admired pieces of military architecture in the world, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The textbook example of a concentric castle with its walls inside walls, and its towered gatehouses, and its own fortified dock. It was also never finished. To understand why, and to understand what a castle actually did to the finances of the people who built one, we need to go back to the spring of 1295, and to a Welsh town that no longer exists. The site Edward I chose was not empty. It was occupied by Llanfaes, a Welsh royal manor, and the principal port of Anglesey. The English response was straightforward. The houses were taken apart, the inhabitants moved. Some resettled at Newborough on the other side of the island, and others absorbed into the new English borough of Beaumaris, going up beside the castle. Before a single stone of the fortress was laid, an entire functioning town had been dismantled and relocated. That was an economic act too, and it does not appear on any building account. Work began that summer under Master James, a Savoyard who had already built or supervised Aberystwyth, Builth, Flint, Rhuddlan, Denbigh, Conwy, and Caernarfon. He had spent his career on Edward's Welsh works, and by 1295 he carried the title master of the king's works in Wales. What makes Beaumaris extraordinary, in my opinion, for anyone interested in money rather than masonry, is that the accounts survive. The work was entered in detail on the pipe rolls, the running record of royal expenditure kept by the Exchequer at Westminster. Because of those rolls, the early construction of Beaumaris is better documented than almost anything else built in medieval Britain. We are not estimating. We can read the payroll. And the payroll is staggering. Across that first summer, the site averaged 1,800 workmen. Among them, 450 stonemasons and 375 quarriers. Add the carpenters, the smiths, the diggers, the carters, the boatmen, bringing limestone and sandstone and schist to the shoreline. And the labor force on Anglesey in 1295 was larger than the population of most English towns. Wages alone were consuming something in the region of £270 a week. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is the single most useful figure in this entire story. Not the headline total. The weekly burn. By November of 1295, when the building season closed for winter, more than £6,700 had been spent on one building site in 7 months. Over 2,000 of that went on materials. The rest largely on wages and on paying the soldiers stationed there while the walls were still knee-high. The Crown could not keep up. The project fell into arrears almost immediately, and the officials on site ran short of actual coin to hand out at the end of the week. Their solution was to issue leather tokens instead of money, promises against a payment that had not yet arrived from London. Men who had spent a day breaking stone in the Anglesey rain were being handed a piece of leather and told the silver was coming. That is the situation Master James was writing about the following February. He was not being dramatic. He was explaining to the barons of the Exchequer why a week at Beaumaris cost what it cost. 400 masons, both the cutters and the layers. 2,000 less skilled workmen. 200 quarrymen. 30 smiths. The carts and the wagons and the 30 boats. Carpenters for joists and floorboards. And then the line that reframes the whole document, where he points out that none of this accounts for the garrison, and none of it accounts for the purchases of material, of which a great quantity would still be needed. He finishes by telling them the pay is badly in arrears, and that he is having enormous difficulty holding his workforce together, because the men have nothing to live on. In the postscript he asks them, for God's sake, to be quick with the money, or everything done so far will have been for nothing. That is not a builder boasting about scale. That is a project manager watching his labor force starve. Now widen the lens, because Beaumaris was not a standalone decision. It was the last piece of a program. After the conquest of Gwynedd, Edward I threw a ring of fortresses around Snowdonia: Flint, Rhuddlan, Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, and finally Beaumaris, along with town walls, harbors, and planted English boroughs to go with them. Between 1277 and 1304, the Welsh works absorbed something on the order of £80,000. Conwy alone, with its 8 drum towers rising straight out of the rock above the estuary, went up in roughly 4.5 years for something close to £15,000. In the peak summer of 1286, the Conwy site employed nearly 950 men, among them well over 200 masons, more than 100 quarriers, 30 smiths, and a small army of laborers. Caernarfon, with its banded stone and its polygonal towers, ran higher still once the town walls were counted. This was not paid for out of income. Edward was borrowing heavily across exactly this period from the Ricciardi, a banking family from Lucca in Tuscany, who effectively financed the English crown through the Welsh campaigns and took repayment from customs revenue. The stone walls of North Wales sit on top of Italian credit. Take the bankers out of the story, and the castles do not get built. To see how abnormal this was, compare it to the previous century. Richard I built Stowe Gaillard on a chalk cliff above the Seine between 1196 and 1198. It was the most advanced fortress in Europe at the time, and it cost something like £12,000 in 2 years. In the same period, Richard's total spending on every castle in the whole of England came to about 7,000. His father Henry II had rebuilt Dover, the greatest fortress in the kingdom, for a comparable 7,000 across 12 years of work. So one castle in Normandy outspent an entire kingdom's castle budget, and a century later, Edward I was running 6 of those simultaneously. Which raises the question the whole genre tends to skip. Who, other than a king with Tuscan bankers behind him, could possibly pay for this? The answer is almost nobody. Take a comfortable English baron of the later 13th century, the kind of man with substantial estates and a household of retainers, bringing in something in the region of £700 a year. The finished cost of Beaumaris, at £15,000, represents roughly 20 years of that man's entire revenue. 20 years of everything, spent on one building, in one place, leaving nothing for food, horses, armor, servants, marriages, lawsuits, or war. Go back a century, and the picture is bleaker still. A survey of 54 English barons from 12th century records gives an average income of a little over £200. But the median sits closer to 115, because a handful of great magnates drag the average upward, and around 20 of those 54 men were living on under £100 a year. A baron in that bracket could not have paid for a single tower at Beaumaris, let alone the 12 it was designed to have. So the picture in your head of a lord standing in front of his battlements is quietly wrong for the great stone castles. The concentric fortress, with its double walls and archer galleries and gatehouse machinery, was a royal instrument, or the property of a very small number of men operating at near royal scale. Everyone else made do with earthwork, timber, a modest tower house, or nothing at all. If you're finding this useful, subscribe. I go through the real numbers behind medieval life every week, from cathedral finance to what it costs to field an army. Now, back to Anglesey, and to the part of castle economics that almost nobody discusses. Because building the thing turns out to be the cheap half. Master James got some of his money. Not enough. Work slowed through 1296. The debts kept accumulating, and the following year, the pace fell off further. By 1300, it had stopped completely, with roughly £11,000 spent. The cause was 200 miles to the north. Edward's war in Scotland had opened, and it swallowed both his attention and his treasury. Beaumaris, the castle designed to hold down an island that was no longer really rebelling, simply lost its place in the queue. What that left on the ground was not a castle. The inner walls and towers stood at a fraction of their intended height. The north and northwestern sides had no outer defenses at all. The most sophisticated fortress design in Europe was sitting on the Anglesey shore as a half-height ring of masonry with a gap in it. In 1306, worried about a Scottish landing in North Wales, Edward looked at Beaumaris again and discovered something that will be familiar to anyone who has ever left a building unattended. The unfinished castle had already fallen into disrepair. 6 years of Welsh weather had gone to work on walls that had never been roofed or capped. Work restarted on the outer defenses under James at first, and then after his death in 1309 under Master Nicholas de Durniford. It crawled along for another 2 decades, and finally halted for good in 1330. Some real progress had been made by then, with the gap in the outer circuit closed and further towers built. But the castle still did not reach its designed height, and the 5 separate accommodation suites the plan called for were never built. Total spend by that point, £15,000. 13 years later, in 1343, William de Imeldon, Chancellor of the Irish Exchequer, was sent round the Welsh castles to survey them after Edward the Black Prince was made Prince of Wales. What he found at Beaumaris reads like a builder's snag list. The chamber above the sea gate was dilapidated. Several towers had no roofs, which meant the chambers beneath them were ruinous. The chapel tower was unfinished. The kitchen was unusable. Parts of the battlements had fallen. The southern gatehouse was in bad repair, and the staircases in the towers flanking the northern gate were still incomplete. His estimate for the essential repairs came to around £680. Nobody paid it. Think about what has happened here in purely financial terms. I think this is crazy actually for that time in their economy. £15,000 has been sunk into an asset. That asset is incomplete, so it does not deliver its designed capability. A survey identifies a comparatively small sum, less than 5% of what has already been spent, that would bring it much closer to functional. And the crown declines, because the money is going to France now, and the enemy that justified the castle is no longer a serious threat. That is a stranded asset. It is a 13th century version of a problem every finance department recognizes, and it is the reason the castle you can walk around today has stubby towers. But here is what makes castles genuinely different from a failed building project. A failed building project stops costing you money. A castle does not. From the moment there was anything at Beaumaris worth defending, the crown was paying for a constable and a standing garrison. In the early years, that meant William de Felton as constable, with a body of knights, 20 crossbowmen, and 100 archers stationed inside. The archers were pulled out after 1296, once the immediate danger had passed, and the accountants had noticed the bill. That withdrawal is worth pausing on, in my opinion, because it tells you exactly how these decisions got made. The garrison was not sized by the threat, it was sized by what the exchequer could stand. And the garrison is only the visible line item. A castle in use needs its wells maintained, its roofs relieved, its timber floors replaced as they rot, its ironwork replaced as it rusts, its moat kept from silting, its drains kept clear, its stores restocked, its constable housed and paid, and its walls repointed against weather that never takes a year off. Stone does not decay quickly, which is exactly why castles fool people. Everything attached to the stone decays fast. Roofs, floors, doors, hinges, gates, hoardings, the whole functional skeleton has a life measured in decades, and a castle is expected to last centuries. So the annual cost of owning a fortress is not a rounding error against the build. Over a long enough life, it exceeds it. And unlike the build, it never stops, and it never produces revenue. A cathedral generated pilgrims and offerings. A mill ground grain for a fee. A castle produced security, which is real but unmonetizable. And the moment the threat receded, it produced nothing at all while continuing to invoice you every single year. Watch how that plays out at Beaumaris over the next 3 centuries. In 1400, revolt broke out across North Wales under Owain Glyndwr. Beaumaris was besieged and captured by Welsh forces in 1403 and retaken by royal troops 2 years later. The one time the castle was seriously tested, it fell, in part because it had never been finished and had been left to deteriorate for 70 years. After that, the slide is continuous. Minor repairs happened. Nothing substantial did. By 1534, the constable, Roland de Belleville, was reporting to London that there was scarcely a chamber in Beaumaris where a man could lie down and stay dry. Rain was coming into most of the rooms of a fortress that had cost £15,000. 5 years later, in 1539, the new constable Richard Bulkeley wrote to Thomas Cromwell to describe the place as ruinous and far in decay, and to point out that its entire arsenal amounted to 8 or 10 small guns and about 40 bows. With Henry VIII worried about a Scottish landing through Wales, Bulkeley went out and bought gunpowder, bows, arrows, helmets, and body armor for the garrison out of his own pocket. That detail deserves its own moment. By the 16th century, the running cost of the king's castle had been quietly transferred to the man administering it, because the crown would not fund it, and the constable could not defend an empty building. The Civil War produced one last spasm of investment. Thomas Bulkeley held Beaumaris for Charles I, and may have spent around £3,000, improving the defenses of a castle that had been leaking for 100 years. It surrendered to Parliament in 1646, was briefly retaken during the Anglesey Rising of 1648, and surrendered again in October. Parliament chose not to slight it, not out of respect, but because a royalist invasion from Scotland still looked possible, and the walls might be needed. Colonel John Jones was installed as governor with a garrison inside, and that garrison cost £1,703 a year. Compare that to the £270 a week Master James was spending in 1295, and you can see the shape of the whole story. 3.5 centuries after construction, on a building that had never been completed, the annual bill for simply keeping soldiers inside it was more than a tenth of what the entire original construction had cost. Then, in 1660, Charles II returned to the throne, the Bulkeleys were restored as constables, and the garrison went away. And with the garrison gone, Beaumaris was stripped. The lead came off, which meant the roofs came off, and once the roofs come off a stone building, the weather finishes the job for free. That is the final stage of castle economics. When the asset stops earning its keep, it is not maintained, and it is not demolished. It is harvested. The valuable materials are pulled out and sold, and the walls are left standing, because knocking them down would cost money too. Which brings us to the last number, and the most quietly devastating one in my opinion. In 1807, Thomas Bulkley, the 7th Viscount Bulkley, bought Beaumaris Castle outright from the crown. He absorbed it into the parkland around his house at Baron Hill, as a picturesque ruin for visitors to admire. At a moment when travelers and landscape painters had decided that ivy-covered medieval walls were romantic. He paid £735. £15,000 went into the ground on Anglesey. 5 centuries later, the entire castle changed hands for less than the cost of the repairs nobody was willing to fund in 1343. And the meter is still running. Beaumaris today is a World Heritage Site in the care of the Welsh Government's Historic Environment Service, and a scheduled monument of that significance requires continuous conservation. Masonry consolidation, drainage, visitor infrastructure, surveys, scaffolding, specialist stonework. The castle has now been costing somebody money, without interruption, for 730 years. So what did a medieval castle actually cost? The building account is the easy answer, and it is the wrong one. £15,000 is what it cost to stop building Beaumaris. The real cost was everything that followed. The garrison payrolls across 3 centuries. The repairs deferred until they became replacements. The lead that had to be relayed every few generations. The constables paying for gunpowder out of their own income because the treasury had moved on. The conservation budgets of the modern era. And the opportunity cost of a sum that could have funded a small war, sunk instead into a ring of stone on an island that had already been pacified. Master James of St. George understood this better than the men he was writing to. Read his letter again, with the economics in mind, and you notice that his real subject is not the 400 masons. It is the sentence where he tells the exchequer that what he has listed does not include the garrison, and does not include the materials still to be bought. He was telling them, politely, that they had no idea what they had signed up for. He was right. They spent 35 more years finding out. And then they gave up. And the building they abandoned kept sending the bill for another 400 years. To men who had never met Edward I, defending an island against enemies who never came.